you got a Bible, go to Nehemiah chapter 10. Today, we are going to finish the Ruins and Renewal series. We're going to make it through the end of the book of Nehemiah. And so if you're like, man, that's awesome. Long time coming. I know. We've been in this for a while. And so here's what we're going to do. I'm just going to jump in. We're going to be walking through the end of chapter 10 all the way through the end of chapter 13, but I'm going to move really quickly through chapters 11 and 12. Here's our main idea. The hope of renewal is not temporary change. It is lasting transformation. And what we'll do is, at the end of chapter 10, we're going to see this beautiful reason to celebrate. And then when we get into chapter 13, we're going to see it all fall down. And so let me pray briefly again for the word, and then we'll jump in. And so, Father, you speak out of the volume of the book. This is not just a history lesson. This is not just a memoir of some person thousands of years ago's life. It is actually living and active for us today. So Jesus would say this often, and I pray it over us. Would you give us ears to hear, that we might listen and faithfully respond? So in your matchless name I pray. Amen. Nehemiah chapter 10, starting verse 28, and this is going to look familiar to you because last week one of our elders, Alex, preached through this text, and if you didn't get to hear that message, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to it. I'm not going to dive deep. I just want to set the frames using this text. And so verse 28 says this: the rest of the people, the priests, Levites, gatekeepers, singers, and temple servants, along with their wives and sons and daughters, and everyone who is able to understand, and who has separated from the surrounding peoples to obey the law of God, join with the noble brothers and commit themselves with a sworn oath to follow the law of God given through God's servant Moses, and to obey carefully all the commands, ordinances, and statutes of the Lord, our Lord. Now, again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but just want you to hear, this is coming on the tail end of chapter 8, where they come together and they're celebrating this festival of booths, this feast of tabernacles, and recognizing that they haven't been faithful to the Lord. And Nehemiah and Ezra encourage them, hey, the joy of the Lord is your strength. You shouldn't be mourning, you should be celebrating. They celebrate the festival, then they have a solemn assembly, and then after the solemn assembly, they continue to hear the word. They begin to feel the weight of the word and say, hey, the Lord's been really faithful to us, and we've been unfaithful to him, and we recognize that. And the tail end of that is here in chapter 10, where they recognize that and say, so we're going to commit ourselves. We're recommitting to the covenant. And then here's the details of what they committed to. We will not give our daughters in marriage. And some of you dads just said, you can just stop there, full stop. We ain't going to give our daughters in marriage. That's not actually what the text says. It says, we will not give our daughters in marriage to the surrounding peoples, and will not take their daughters as wives for our sons. When the surrounding peoples bring merchandise or any kind of grain to sell on the Sabbath day, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath day or a holy day. We will also leave the land uncultivated in the 7th year, and will cancel every debt. So this is part of their economic system. We will impose the following commands on ourselves: to give 1/8 of an ounce of silver yearly for the service of the house of our God, the bread displayed before the Lord, the daily grain offering, the regular burnt offering, the Sabbath and new moon offerings, the appointed festivals, the holy things, the sin offerings to atone for Israel, and for all the work of the house of our God. And so this is a commitment to make sure that they are giving towards the spiritual worship, sacrificial work, and the sacrificial system that they lived under. We have cast lots among the priests, Levites, and people for the donation of wood by our ancestral families at the appointed time each year. They are to bring the wood to our God's house to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. And so again, this is a practice of making sure that they are donating the wood needed for the daily sacrifices. We will bring first fruits of our land and of our every fruit tree to the Lord's house year by year. We will also bring the firstborn of our sons and our livestock. So here, land, labor, livestock, as prescribed by the law, and we'll bring the firstborn of our herds and flocks to the house of our God, to the priest who will serve in our God's house. We'll bring a loaf from our first batch of dough to the priest at the storeroom of the house of our God. We will also bring the first fruits of our grain offerings, of every fruit tree, and of every new wine and fresh oil. 1/10 of our land's produce belongs to the Levites, for the Levites are to collect the 1/10 offering in all of our agricultural towns. A priest from Aaron's descendants is to accompany the Levites when they collect the tenth, and the Levites are to take a tenth of this offering to the storerooms of the treasury of the house of our Lord. For the Israelites and the Levites are to bring the contributions of grain, new wine, and fresh oil to the storerooms while the articles of the sanctuary are kept, where the articles of the sanctuary are kept, and where the priests who minister are, along with the gatekeepers and singers. And then the definitive statement at the end is, we will not neglect the house of our God. So all of this is a sign of commitment to the covenant. We are going to do these things. And this feels like a really powerful moment. Like if this has been missing in their history, if this is kind of the final missing piece of going from rebuilding the altar to rebuilding the temple to rebuilding the wall to now we are going to live as we were called to live under the covenant, it feels like we have all the way arrived. If this series is called Ruins and Renewal, we finally got past all the ruins and got to the renewal. And then as you move into chapter 11 and 12, chapter 11 is how people are repopulating in Jerusalem, and it's a long list of names. This literally feels like the end credits scene in a movie. And partly because there are lots of names that nobody reads unless you're somebody's mama and you're trying to make sure your kid's there. But also because it feels like the story is coming to an end and that they're fully moving back in. And then you get into chapter 12 and they have this dedication ceremony for the wall. We are at this place where it feels like we have a reason to celebrate. But Marvel's ruined us. And we know that in every end credit scene that there's going to be something at the end that as we're watching and we're like, it feels like the world's safe, that Thanos is sitting in the background waiting for us. Nehemiah chapter 13. Nehemiah chapter 13 verse 1 says this: at the time the book of Moses was read publicly to the people, the command was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the Israelites with food and water. Instead, they hired Balaam against them to curse them, but our God turned the curse into a blessing. When they heard the law, they separated all those of mixed descent from Israel. Now before this, the priest Eliashib had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was a relative of Tobiah and had prepared a large room for him where they had previously stored the grain offerings, the frankincense, the articles, and the tenths of grain, new wine, and fresh oil prescribed for the Levites and singers and gatekeepers, along with the contributions for the priest. While all this was happening, I, Nehemiah, was not in Jerusalem because I had returned to King Artaxerxes of Babylon in the 32nd year of his reign. It was only later that I asked the king for a leave of absence so I could return to Jerusalem. Then I discovered the evil that Eliashib had done on behalf of Tobiah by providing him a room in the courts of God's house. I was greatly displeased and threw all of Tobiah's household possessions out of the room. I ordered that the rooms be purified, and I had the articles of the house of God restored there, along with the grain offering and frankincense. And so I don't want to go too far because actually the next few verses after this link together and actually create a singular idea. But I do want to give some context here. Because Nehemiah, in writing this, seems to be referring to something historical that may have been top of mind for them, but far from us. And so he makes a statement that they were reading the book of Moses, and they recognized that the law said, hey, no Ammonite or no Moabite should have any place in staying in the temple because of the way that Balaam and those Moabites back in the day had existed. So that's a significant story. It's Numbers chapter 22, 23. And you may not know Balaam, but you know Balaam's donkey. Because I got to say, I think Balaam's donkey is probably the third most famous donkey of all time. So you got Jesus' donkey that he rides into Jerusalem, who gets a prophecy and gets to ride with Jesus. Number two, you got Shrek's donkey. And then I think Balaam's a close third. Like, I think it's right there. And so here's the story of Balaam's donkey. So Balaam is a prophet, and the king of Moab reaches out to him and says, hey, all of these Israelite people, they cover the land like sand covering the seashore. Like, they've shown up, and I'm a little intimidated by them, and if they turn against me, they're going to fight me. So would you curse them so that way I can attack them and beat them? Because whatever you bless is blessed, and whatever you curse is cursed. And he's like, let me go talk to God about this. So he goes to the Lord, and the Lord's like, no, don't go with them. And he's like, look, guys, I can't go. The Lord said, I can't go. It's kind of like when you didn't want to hang out with that friend, and so you go to your mom, you're like, I want to hang out with Billy. No, you don't have to hang out with Billy. So he goes back and tells them, I'm not gonna go. So then they send more people back. Balak sends more people back to Balaam. And this time he goes to the Lord, and the Lord's like, you know what, you should go with him. And he's like, all right, but don't say anything that I didn't tell you to say. So he's on his way to go, and he's riding his donkey, and the donkey stops in the road because the donkey can see an angel of the Lord that's there to attack Balaam. And Balaam starts beating on the donkey. Gets back on the donkey, starts riding again, and he pushes the donkey into the field, and then the angel of the Lord standing in the field, so the donkey stops again, and Balaam starts beating the donkey. And there's this narrow pass, and so he's pressed up against the wall, the donkey's crushing Balaam's foot against the wall because the angel of the Lord is pushing him that way. And so he gets off of the donkey, starts beating the donkey, and the donkey is like, why are you doing this to me? What have I done to deserve this? And in the weirdest thing in all scripture, he's not like, oh man, my donkey's talking to me, what's going on? He was like, because you made me look like a fool, so now you're arguing with your donkey. If you were worried about your image before, you've gone a whole nother level now. And so the donkey was like, hey, in all the years that you've ridden me, have I ever treated you this way? And he was like, I guess not. So now your donkey is reasoning with you. And then he opens his eyes and he can see that the angel of the Lord is there. And the angel of the Lord is like, yeah, if it hadn't been for your donkey, I would have slaughtered you in the streets. That's my interpretation of how that said. It doesn't say it that way exactly in your Bible. And so then he ends up going on to Moab, and they expect him to curse, and he begins to bless. And this is how the whole story plays out. And so instead of Moab and Ammon trying to help the Israelites were in this wilderness situation, they were trying to curse them. And so that's where this comes from. And so there's this deep historical understanding about what's going on with the people of God. And then I think it's significant for us to point out that verse 6 and 7 tell us some of the root of the problem. It says that Nehemiah had left and gone. So here, I'll read the verses to you. While all this was happening, I was not in Jerusalem because I had returned to King Artaxerxes of Babylon in the 32nd year of his reign. It was only later that I asked the king for a leave of absence so I could return to Jerusalem. But what I don't want you to be confused by is that this is not an infrastructure problem. This is actually a heart problem. That it doesn't matter how good your infrastructure is, that if things are not applied to the heart, if they're just practices and routines and traditions, then the wrong person doesn't show up at work one day and all of a sudden things become chaos. And so here's what's going on is that he shows up and Eliashib, the priest, has allowed his relative Tobiah into the temple. Now, here's what maybe you're like, that name seems familiar. Yeah, it's that Tobiah. There's a football player that used to play for the Minnesota Vikings. His name was Chris Carter, and you may not know you may not know any of his football stats, but what he's famous for now is that he's worked for ESPN, Fox News, and he has this thing that anytime somebody does something dumb, he just has this phrase, come on, man. And so of all the people that you could let into the temple, come on, man. Of all, Tobiah, who back in chapter 2 of Nehemiah was trying to convince him that he shouldn't be part of rebuilding this wall and was trying to send letters to Artaxerxes saying not do this. Like that Tobiah, come on, man. The Tobiah who was sending threats and trying to convince them that that they had no capability, that they were not able to rebuild a wall. That Tobiah, come on, man. The same Tobiah that was sending threats saying that we're going to kill you if you keep doing this, that Tobiah, come on, man. The same Tobiah that was literally, even after they had moved past the progress of building the wall, was still sending threatening letters to Nehemiah anyways. That same Tobiah, come on, man. Of all the people in the world, you let him back in? It's odd because I actually think this is a bigger deal because it actually, this idea of the temple being the house of God, the place where God's presence dwelt and met with people and keeping the enemies of God out of there, this is not just an Israel in the reign of Artaxerxes problem. I actually think this is a back to the Garden of Eden problem because the sole job of Adam and Eve were to guard and keep the garden, the place of God's presence, meeting with his people and make sure that they kept the enemies out. And it seems like, I don't know that Tobiah is a snake. I don't also know that he's not a snake. But come on, man. You gonna let him back into the center of the life of your people? And maybe the name is not Tobiah. Maybe it's a relationship that you keep running back to that's caused all types of destruction, all types of heartache, and you keep letting it back in your life. Come on, man. Maybe it's an addictive habit that you keep running back to, and it keeps bringing destruction and bringing foolishness and putting your family at risk and threatening the livelihood that you have. And you're running back to that. Can I just, come on, man. We keep running back to this thing. And so, of course, Nehemiah is upset. Nehemiah shows up and grabs Tobiah's stuff and starts throwing it out of the storehouse. I can relate. I don't want to incriminate myself, but there was a time when I had a group of roommates, and one of my roommates was dating a girl, and she got on my nerves. And so I grabbed her stuff and threw it out of the front door on the front lawn. And then when he went to go get her stuff, I locked them both out of the house. I'm not proud of that. I'm actually kind of proud of that. And so, like, I can clearly understand why Nehemiah felt like he wasn't going to ease his way into this. This was a problem because the place of God's presence was being violated by people that weren't supposed to be there. And the text would go on, and it would say, I also found out that because the portions for the Levites had not been given, each of the Levites and the singers performing the service had gone back to his own field. The Levites were not supposed to be working in the fields. They're supposed to be working in the temple, but they didn't have what they needed, so they went back to their old jobs. Therefore, I rebuked the officials, asking, why has the house of God been neglected? I gathered the Levites and singers together and stationed them at their post. Then all of Judah brought 1/10 of the grain, new wine, and fresh oil into the storehouses. I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses the priest Shelemiah, the scribe of Zadok, and Pedaiah of the Levites, and Hanan of Zakur, and the son of Mathaniah, to assist them because they were considered trustworthy. They were responsible for the distribution to their colleagues. Remember me for this, my God, and don't erase the deeds of my faithful love that I've done for the house of my God and for its service. I want you to see verse 11 again, because verse 11 is the clear indictment. He says that I rebuked the officials, asking, why has the house of God been neglected? You remember for the end credit scene that the last thing that they said in chapter 10 was that we will not neglect the house of God. And Nehemiah's like, I wasn't even gone that long. Like, why are you neglecting the house of God? And then what you'll see as we read through this chapter is that each section of him trying to deal with an issue ends with this prayer. He's like, Lord, would you remember me for this? And this is not like, hey, Lord, they're all messed up. I'm awesome. This is, Lord, I know that this isn't ending the way that I thought it was supposed to be. I know this doesn't look like what I left it as, but would you remember that I tried to be faithful even if we didn't get faithful results? And then the next section moves from not honoring the house of God to not honoring the day that God had set aside. It says, at the same time I saw, this is verse 15, I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath. They were also bringing in stores of grain and loading them on donkeys, along with wine, grapes, and figs. All kinds of goods were brought to Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I warned them against selling food on that day. The Tyrians, or the people from Tyre, living there, were importing fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah in Jerusalem. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Didn't your ancestors do the same, so that our God brought all this disaster on us and on this city? And now you're rekindling his anger against Israel by profaning the Sabbath. When shadows began to fall on the city gates of Jerusalem just before the Sabbath, I gave orders that the city gates be closed and not opened until after the Sabbath. I posted some of my men at the gates so that no goods could enter during the Sabbath day. Once or twice, the merchants and those who sell all kinds of goods camped outside of Jerusalem. But I warned them, why are you camping in front of the wall? If you do it again, I will use force against you. Another version might say, I will lay hands on you. Just in case you're confused, he wasn't going to hold a prayer meeting. After that, they did not come again on the Sabbath. Then I instructed the Levites to purify themselves and guard the city gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this also, my God. and look on me with compassion according to the abundance of your faithful love. So maybe the question here is like, why is this such a big deal? In the scriptures, the Lord would make the command in the book of Exodus in particular about keeping the Sabbath holy. It comes from the example of the creation story where on the seventh day he rested, and then he would say in Exodus, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. And the essence of the command is that this will make you like God, because he rested on the seventh day and rested from his labors. But then in Deuteronomy, when they're going over the law again, it actually comes up again, and they're told to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, to not work on that day so that they would not be like Egypt. Well, which is it? Does the Sabbath make you like God, or does the Sabbath keep you from being like Egypt? And I actually think both things are meant to be true. It's actually this reality of where you're drawing your source and your identity from. That to, on that day, say that we're going to sell and do our own thing is actually this affront against God's character and your identity connected to that character. To say that you need to be like Egypt, that constantly was piling on more work. In fact, if you go back to Exodus, one of the issues was that they said, hey, can we take a break and worship? And Pharaoh's like, nah, you don't get a day off to worship. In fact, I'm going to increase the work because we got to keep building the empire. And so maybe in our day, Egypt's not the problem, but the empire certainly is. And so this idea of resting on the Sabbath is this sense of being like God and knowing when to stop and take trust in what he's completed and done and calling that good versus being like the empire that never can have enough. And the tension of living between those two things, Nehemiah walks in and sees them selling at the gates and says, what are you doing? Like, do you not recognize that this is what happened to our ancestors, that this was the mistake that they made, that they did not keep this day of God holy? And you're seeing all of a sudden it's gone from not taking the place of God holy to not taking the time with God to be holy. And now there is an issue here. And can I just warn you, brothers and sisters, I don't care what day you reserve as being your Sabbath. What I would tell you is working endlessly because the empire demands that you are is the most ungospel thing you can do. Because it's saying that I've got to fend for myself and create for myself and sustain myself and to rest in the Lord, to say that I trust you enough that when I'm not able to perform, that you still got me, is a recognition of his goodness that they were not leaning into. So then Nehemiah places guards at the gates and says, don't let anybody in the city. One of my favorite movies growing up was a movie called Lean on Me. And it's the story of a school in New Jersey called East Side High, and they had terrible scores. They're getting ready to shut the school down, and they bring in a man named Joe Clark to lead the school. If you've never seen this movie, it's like from 1988. I'm about to ruin it for you. And so Joe Clark comes in and he was like, look, the biggest problem is that this is not a safe place for our students to learn. There's not a level of discipline and excellence. And so he goes around and he starts locking the doors so that drug dealers can't get into school. And if kids don't get in school before the doors are locked, they don't get in that day. And he's walking around the campus with a bat, so much so that they're calling him Batman. And like to the average person, it'd be like, man, Joe Clark is insane. And this is one of those movies that's like, okay, based on a true story. So I started doing some research. I'm like, ain't no way dude is walking around the school campus with baseball bats and locking the doors. That's true. Because he was so determined to keep that place sacred for those kids' education that he would do what ultimately broke the law, because that is against fire code to lock people in a building, to make sure that the thing that was going to distract or dissuade them from being faithful wasn't there. Nehemiah is setting a similar standard of saying, we're locking up the city on the Sabbath so that way this cannot come in. And it's not about the fish, and it's not about the merchandise and the goods from Tyre. It is about depending on one's own ability to produce as opposed to resting in the Lord. And he's just guarding against that. And then verse 23. In those days, I also saw Jews who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Remember, Ammon and Moab were a challenge previously when it came to the temple. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples, but could not speak Hebrew. if I rebuked them, cursed them, beat some of their men, and pulled out their hair. Do you know how angry you got to be to pull somebody's hair out their head? Like, this is just a bad day in church. Some of you are like, I don't know. If you beat somebody up, it might not be that bad. Like don't do that. Like, it's not okay. Like, Nehemiah has now moved into this place of like visceral reaction to the sin that's around him that none of us would celebrate as a leader. Like, this will get you on a podcast in 2025, right? I forced them to take an oath before God and said, you must not give your daughters in marriage to their sons or take their daughters as wives for your sons or yourselves. Didn't King Solomon of Israel sin in matters like this? There was not a king like him among many nations. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all of Israel, yet foreign women drew him into sin. Why then should we hear about you doing all this terrible evil and acting unfaithfully against our God by marrying foreign women? Even one of the sons of Jehoiada, son of the high priest Eliashib, this family is obviously a problem, had become a son-in-law to Sanballat. Come on, man. The Horonite. So I drove him away from me. Remember them, my God, for defiling the priesthood, as well as the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. So I purified them from everything foreign and assigned specific duties to each of the priests and Levites. I also arranged for the donation of wood at the appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, my God, with favor. All right. Well, Nehemiah didn't do me any favors by ending the book this way, because this feels kind of awful. Not just his reaction, but really the idea of what's happening in the text, that they are separating from people who are not Israelites. Like, particularly in our moment in history. Like, if we just look at the last century plus, how many wars have started because one group of people by culture and ethnicity decided that they didn't like another group of people by culture and ethnicity? Just name World War I, World War II, the Bosnian conflict, like the Red Scare that we lived through. Like, that's been a problem throughout history. But even in our cultural moment, every time that you look at your news feed, whether it's the Israelis and Hamas, or whether it's the Ukrainians and Russians, or whether it's even in our nation at this moment, U.S. citizens trying to determine how we interact with those who are undocumented, like this tension of peoples that seem to think that they have different cultural identities, that this is a big question, and this feels like a crazy way to respond to it. So I think it's important that we think through the text really deeply. And in fact, maybe you're like, man, I feel like we've been here before, because several months ago at the end of Ezra, Capena preached through a similar text with a similar tension. And I think the two things that he shared then that I think is important for us to see now is one, the scriptures are both prescriptive and descriptive. And so here's the problem with the Bible. It's a little too honest for its own good. And so you've got to deal with the messiness of people. You got to deal with leaders who get a little bit upset, wild out a little bit, pull somebody's hair out on the way to work. Like that's true in the text, but there's also this reality that you have to deal with, that sometimes it's just describing or being descriptive of what's happening versus being prescriptive of what should happen. And so we've got this tension of what it's describing. Are we called to do the same thing? And I think sometimes, if we're not careful, we can draw a principle from the text and say, okay, well, we should act this way. I don't think that the text is giving you carte blanche permission that if somebody has a different ethnic culture or cultural identity from you, that you should have nothing to do with them. Because I could also look at the text and he says that what seems to be going on is that the men are working and that their wives are the ones that are discipling and training their kids, and so their kids are growing up a certain way. I could also say that this text should say, hey, men, your job with your family is not just to earn money. Nobody wants me to preach that sermon, because that's not the key principle to the text. The key principle to the text is then the second thing, that they're not separating because of race, they're actually separating because of religion. That in that day and age and in that culture, that your religious identity was so ingrained with your civic identity, and that part of what God was calling his people to do was to be noticeably different than the world. And we just talked about this with the Sabbath, that you took the day off, not because it was the most productive mechanism or got you some jump on the market, but it was because you were trying to look different than the rest of the world, because the rest of the world didn't worship Yahweh. And so there was this tension that was happening over and over again in the scriptures, that these people, instead of bringing people into their lives, because the law made all types of provision for foreigners and sojourners to become part of the people of God and worship with them and be part of their lifestyle, but they weren't bringing them in, they were going out. I heard a man say it this way: don't walk up in here and be like, well, Jesus spent all his time with sinners, but he didn't act like them. And the problem with Israel is that they were spending time with foreign nations and not showing those foreign nations what it looks like to be distinct unto God, but instead they were becoming like these foreign nations, worshiping what they were worshiping, going after what they were going after, valuing what they were valuing, and it was turning them away from being faithful to God. And so Nehemiah takes this real seriously and begins to get upset and respond. And then he ends by removing those in the priesthood who had participated in that. And then the final verse feels like a brokenhearted prayer. Remember me with favor, God. This all looks so bad. It looks all busted up. Can you remember me kindly? I know that this doesn't look the way that it's supposed to. I know it feels like I'm a failure, but would you remember me with favor? The final chapter of Nehemiah reminds us that great leaders and stellar systems can still come up empty. Man, we've spent a lot of weeks talking about, man, look at how prayerful Nehemiah is. Look how patient he is. Look at how wise he is. Look how he's assessing the situation. He's building collaboration, bringing people in. He's fighting against injustice. And then we end the book like, this feels awful. Nobody's like, my life verse, Nehemiah chapter 13. Like nobody's ever said that. Because this chapter is awful. Like all the things that had been built up seem to be falling apart. In fact, there's this idea in the world called a failure cascade. And it's when one thing after another fails in succession because nothing is strong enough to stop the brokenness that's happening. This feels like an awful failure cascade. The place of God was disrespected, and the time with God was being disrespected. And now even in the homes of the people of God, that he has no place with them. Like this seems to be falling more and more into disrepair. And so as good of a leader as he was, and as stellar of a system that he put in place, it feels like it's all falling down. It feels like we're moving more towards ruins than we are renewal. So I said it before, but I'll say it again. The hope of renewal is not temporary change. It's lasting transformation. At this point, you're like, you better pull the nose of this plane up. Better bring Nick back and talk about how the Lord's moving in the world, because it's making me mad with this text. I'll leave you with two thoughts. Reforms don't guarantee renewal. Only transformed hearts can do that. I think the problem in our thinking is oftentimes that we think if we can do the thing better, then we will be better. Back in, I think it was 1522, I think that it's been 500 years since the Protestant Reformation, when Martin Luther nailed the theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg. The unique thing about that was that he wasn't suggesting something new. He was actually suggesting go back to old faithfulness. And some of us would say, man, if we're going to really experience renewal, we need to go back to the things that we used to do, whatever that favorite thing that you used to do was. But reforms don't guarantee renewal. And others of us in the room are like, man, we just got to start doing the new stuff. Like, get rid of all the old, empty stuff that's useless. Let's try something new. Let's do this. Let's have church on the moon. It's difficult without oxygen, but we figured it out. And we're like, if we could find the new method, then renewal's gonna break out. Or maybe we say, if we could just get the right person in place, the right preacher, the right leader, the right small group leader, the right worship leader, if we could just get the right person in place, man, this joint's gonna pop off. But reforms don't guarantee renewal. We watched all this infrastructure change and leadership and commitment. And the hard thing is that they were doing the stuff, but it didn't change them. This is like saying, I'm going to buy new gym clothes so I can get in shape. Some of y'all laugh because I don't have to press that point. I'm going to go ahead and move on. So I've already said, this feels awful. We've gone on this entire journey from Haggai to Ezra to Nehemiah to end up that they've rebuilt the stuff, but it doesn't seem like they're that much different as a people. We are 100 years past exile, and they still got some exile in them. So what do we do with that? Because the final words of this book don't feel all that comforting. But the final words of Nehemiah are not the Lord's final words. The final words of Nehemiah leave us disappointed and disconcerted, but the Lord doesn't leave us hanging. So the contemporary to Nehemiah, the end of Nehemiah, is a prophet named Malachi. And when you read the book of Malachi, much of what Malachi is prophesying against and dealing with is these type of things, the way that they've been unfaithful in the giving of the tithe, the way that they've been treating the subject of divorce, the way that they've been acting unfaithful to the Lord and living in injustice. But the book of Malachi doesn't start with, here's all the things that you've done wrong. This is actually what the book of Malachi starts with. Malachi 1, if you're like, is that how you say that? It is not Malachi. Malachi 1 says a pronouncement. The word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. I have loved you. Like, with all the stuff that they've done wrong, the first thing out of Malachi's mouth to them is not, come on, man. You let Tobiah back in. You're got family members that are marrying Sanballat's family members. You're not taking care of the priest. You're neglecting the house of the Lord. You're doing all the things wrong. Like you're not honoring the Sabbath. Like his first word isn't, here's all the stuff that you've done wrong. His first word isn't, let me evaluate how far you've fallen. Way back 90 years ago, you came back home and we told you to do this thing right, and you slinked around and you didn't rebuild the temple, and so we had to send a prophet to tell you to do that. And then Ezra told you to not be intermarrying, and you kept doing it, and then now you've got this issue. He doesn't say any of that. The only thing that comes out of his mouth to start the conversation is, this is the posture of God's towards you, that even though I know all the stuff that you've done, I have loved you. I just need you to know that the Lord knows what he bought. There was no part of your life that was hidden that he was like, wait a minute, what? You did what last week? When that's exposed, his response to that is, I have loved you. That I saw you were in the middle of it. I saw when you were running to it. I saw when you tried to rest on the empire instead of resting in me, and I have still loved you. I saw when you didn't take the house of God and the time with God to be all that important and used it for something else, and I still have loved you. I saw when you tried to push away my identity and link yourself up to somebody else's identity, and I have still loved you. And my prayer for us is that would be the transformation that ignites our hearts into renewal. That we have a God who loves us so deeply that he didn't send Jesus to redeem us after we had 90 days of probation of figuring it out. But with Tobias still living up in our house and us associating with Sanballat and us not caring about the time with God or the house of God, he said, I'm going to send my son in the middle of your sin to redeem you because I have loved you. Starting next week, we're going to spend some time just staring at the gospel week after week. And some of you are like, man, I got it. I prayed the prayer. The gospel is not just the diving board that you dive off of. It's the pool that you dive into. It's the reminder over and over again that he has loved you. And my prayer is that we would swim in those waters deeply even today. Let me pray for us. So Jesus, I thank you. I thank you that you are the evidence of God's love for us. Romans 5 would even tell us that while we were still sinners, that because of his love for us, he sent you to die for us. And so, Lord, I pray that men and women under my voice would hear that today. That maybe they're like the people of Jerusalem, that they have made vows and commitments to you about how they're going to live, but all the change in practices hasn't changed their heart yet. And they find themselves letting that Tobiah back into their life. They find themselves snuggling up to Sanballat. They find themselves resting in the identity of the empire instead of resting in the gospel of peace. Would you speak louder than I could? And yet you have loved them. Yet you have come near to them. Yet you have sent your son for them to forgive and redeem and transform them and give them the grace that they need to turn away from those things and turn back to you. Lord, would we not put up pretenses like we're okay, but would we lower the wall and would we receive it? Would we respond to that love? And would we be transformed by it? It's in your matchless name I pray. Amen.
Thanks so much for checking out this message from Kings Harbor. We would love to connect with you. If you go to kingsharbor.org/hello and fill out a short connect card, that allows us the opportunity to follow up with you. Also, if this message has been a blessing to your life, we believe that the Lord wants to rule and reign in every part of who we are. That means our time, our talent, our treasure. And so if this has been a blessing, we would ask that you would consider contributing back to the ministries of Kings Harbor so we can continue to bless and help people in the same way that we hope we have done for you. With that in mind, we want you to know that our heart towards you and our heart towards the world around us is that we want to be a love-forward people. And we're praying that you would join us in that.